Hello and welcome to Guilty Greenie. We are your imperfect host. I'm Cait Bagby, climate storyteller and sustainability content creator.
And I'm Sarah Ferris, very green around the gills greenie. Well, hopefully not so green anymore. I'm getting less green, I'd like to think. But if you are kind of like me and don't know your carbon footprint from your tennis elbow, then you've come to the right place. Because we're tired of perfectionism and trying to live more sustainably.
Join us as we share our own guilt, our own journeys, and just add some levity in our attempts and fails to be more eco-friendly, but in the real world.
And today we are going to be chatting about climate storytelling and denialism. What a terrifying word that is. Yeah.
It's everywhere. It's hidden in plain sight. But we aren't going to be talking about it alone today. Sarah has let me off the research hook. Finally, we are going to be joined by Nate Hegyi of Outside In podcast. And he is a true master of storytelling when it comes to climate change and all things environmental. So we are looking forward to hearing about his experience and just learn a little bit more about things to look for as you're going through climate and environmental news so you know what to be aware of.
I'm going to start with the dumbest of the dumb questions because, you know, that's what I bring. Let's talk about what that word means, denialism. Like when you're talking about it in the climate space, what do you mean?
So there are two types of denialism. There's old denialism and new denialism. Old denialism is quite simply climate change is happening or it's not happening, but it's certainly not caused by humans. New denialism is attacking the solutions. So saying wind power is killing all the birds. It's also attacking the science as well as the climate movements. It's a way for denialists to avoid having to explain what's actually happening by inserting a bit of skepticism into the climate science.
Right, not based in facts. Oh, that's fascinating. So, Cait, tell me a little bit about our guest today. Fill us all in. Who have we got coming on?
So today we are joined by Nate Hegyi, and he is the host and senior producer of the Outside In podcast, which is produced by the New Hampshire Public Radio. He is all about stories that entertain, that really probe, and what I appreciate a lot, it leaves you with that kind of, I never knew that, or I never thought about it that way.
I agree.
Outside In is taking a curious approach to the natural world, but it blends really solid reporting with phenomenal storytelling and incredible guests. And it oftentimes you kind of feel like you're in the midst of their conversation, like you're there, which I always really appreciate. It feels intimate, but incredibly insightful. Outside In has been a standout in the environmental podcasting world. It covers incredible stories, but a lot of these stories are not things we hear about in mainstream media. So they're really putting focus and emphasis on these kind of hidden stories, which help to detail and explain climate change and the little nuances of environmentalism and what that looks like, both in a big picture, but also to individuals as well.
When you told me that Outside In host Nate was coming on, obviously I started listening to the podcast for the first time. And normally I'm either listening to history podcasts or true crime podcasts. So I was like switching gears and I thought, oh, how am I going to enjoy this? But honestly, I was hooked straight away because I think I dove in at the first episode, which was something about Kiwi. And I was like, oh my God, we're talking about Kiwis. But then the other one that was really, I just was like, oh my goodness, this is mind-blowing stuff, was he did an episode on, I think it was called like the secret mass extinctions.
Oh, I haven't listened to that one.
Oh, it's really good. So it's about how we class something as extinct. Like what are the parameters for things that become extinct in terms of animals and how many have become extinct in the last 80 years and how long does it take and da-da-da-da. And they used an example of a specific, I want to say, woodpecker that hadn't been seen for 80 years, but they still can't class it as extinct because they're still hunting for it like the Sasquatch, essentially. So it was really good.
Nate, welcome to Guilty Greenie.
Thanks for having me.
We are very excited about this conversation. Sarah and I had a little bit of a chat beforehand about climate denialism, the difference between old denialism and new denialism, what that looks like specifically on social media, and how important it is to inject a bit of curiosity and humor into storytelling.
Yeah.
You are a natural at it. So talk to us a little bit about your journey in reporting and how your style has maybe changed over the years.
Yeah, I started as a public radio reporter for a group of NPR member stations called the Mountain West News Bureau in the Mountain West here in the United States. And a lot of my first kind of stories, we ran the gamut from doing stories about tribal affairs to environmental stories to the pandemic. It was just a broad beat. But I really focused on public lands and federal agencies that manage them. So like the Interior Department and the U.S. Forest Service. And I think in those days, I'm very happy with the work that we did. We did some really wild and fun stuff. But there's a stiltedness, I think, to public radio, traditional public radio stories that we fell pretty squarely into the mode of, which most public radio stations do. It's just a long history of kind of tell the facts straight in a voice that's very middle of the road, not a lot of highs or lows.
Mm-hmm.
And then a couple of years ago, I left the Bureau and I joined Outside In. And I think the big thing that I learned with this show is twofold. Injecting humor and fun and joy into stories that can otherwise be very doom and gloom, aka climate change stories or your pretty traditional environmental stories. Finding the WTF of stories, which I think is a really good guide star for anybody in narrative storytelling, is like, what's a story that makes somebody say WTF? And then learning to sound way more conversational. We want to make it sound like there is no script, even though there is a script. And so just learning how to speak authoritatively, but conversationally, to have fun and to take the work seriously, but not too seriously. I think that's been my journey and what I've learned, at least with Outside In so far.
I love that. Tell me, coming from a journalist's background, where did the climate crossover and sustainability interest come in for you? Was it just because you ended up on Outside In, or was that something that was in your, I don't know, peripheral?
It's always happened by mistake. I got my undergraduate degree in journalism at the University of Montana. And then I was out of journalism for a long time. I played in a band. I worked at a burrito shop through most of my 20s and just kind of bummed around. And then I wanted to get back into journalism. There was an open spot in the environmental science and natural resource journalism program at the University of Montana. And the professor encouraged me to apply because it would have funding, so I wouldn't have to pay for school, which was great. Environmental science and natural resource journalism, that wasn't, necessarily my interest, but that was the program. And so I did that, did some environmental stories through there, and then through the Bureau. And just working in the West, a lot of the stories we end up doing are very public land centered or climate change centered. It's very hard to avoid out here when you've got wildfires in the summer, you've got drought to contend with, you've got low snowpack, everything else like that. I didn't try to find the beat, but the beat found me. Now, looking back, I've been spending the past 8 years covering climate and sustainability and things like that. And that's what Outside In is all about, is about stories about the natural world, stories about climate change, stories about sustainability. How can we approach that in a fun, exciting, goofy, serious, just weird way?
You and I don't have a too dissimilar of path in how we found our way into environmentalism and climate.
Yeah.
Certainly wasn't something I was seeking out, but I'm glad I'm here.
Right.
There is an episode of Outside In, the Department of Living Animals.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, I don't know if you've listened to this episode.
Not that one.
You need to, because the amount of puns.
Oh yeah.
That's got me written all over it then.
Yeah. There's a lot of puns in Felix's writing. Felix Poon is our producer who produced that, and he loves puns. I don't love puns as much as he does, so there's a lot of me groaning at those puns, I think.
Sarah's the pun queen, and a lot of times they just go right over my head because I'm so focused on the information and then she starts laughing, and it's just
Yeah. I love it so much that in one of my podcast series, every single title of every episode has a pun in it.
That's great. That's amazing. I applaud your devotion to puns.
Thank you. I'm here for it.
I don't love puns, but I live in a world of puns. And so you got to embrace them, I think.
You're
I just need to learn to embrace them.
Yeah,
exactly. A pun survivor.
Speaking of puns and injecting humor, some people would say that injecting humor into what, to your point, is and can be a very doom and gloom subject is or can be slightly irreverent, as if you are not taking it seriously. And so I want to talk a little bit about storytelling and how injecting that bit of humor is neither irreverent and how it helps engage the audience. What's your experience with that?
You got to pick and choose. You're not going to inject a bunch of humor into a story about landslides in Southeast Alaska. Like, we did a story recently that was all about essentially climate change has come knocking at the door of Alaska's capital city. There are more frequent landslides there. They commissioned new hazard maps, which showed that the risk of landslides has expanded. But instead of taking next steps, maybe evacuating people out of those zones, they essentially just shelved the maps. So just what happens when you're faced with increased risk? Why do we continually put our heads in the sand? That's the kind of story that you're not going to have a lot of humor in, but hopefully you found an angle in that is really relatable. I think that's the thing. You don't have to have humor in everything, but you have to make your story relatable, and it's got to be like at very ground level. If you're going to be talking about this amorphous thing that is climate change, that exists in so many different ways, whether it be drought, landslides, wildfire, that kind of thing, you've got to really tell that story in a way that somebody who doesn't really pay attention to climate change might balk at that word climate change, but is interested in the fact that, hey, my house could get wiped out by a landslide,
Right, yeah.
I think connecting that and telling that story in an interesting way is important. Then, at the same time, there is stories about sustainability. We did a series called This, That, or the Other Thing for a little bit. Just as an aside, I think we're always very aware of how loaded the term carbon footprint is and how people can become very myopic and very focused. But there was one episode we did on what is the most sustainable diet. And how we eat does have a big impact on our climate, whether we're eating meat, what kinds of meat we're eating, how we're getting that meat, whether we're hunting it versus farming it. And so through that, that's a kind of thing where you can kind of joke around. And same, by the way, with dog poop bags. We did a whole episode on dog poop bags.
So it's just calling out for some, humor.
Oh, yeah,
sure.
Absolutely. What to do with your dog poop is
actually a shit show.
Yeah, it is. It's actually a shit show. Exactly. And so we do stuff like that. That's kind of like, it's fun. It's funny. It makes people think about climate in a different way, in a way that, like, yes, you can look at climate change and just feel overwhelmed and helpless. Or we can start talking about it in ways that are engaging, sometimes funny, sometimes serious, but in a way that gets people to be interested in solutions, excited about the stories around climate change, and not feeling like it's just so big and hopeless that we just can't do anything about it.
I love that. For me, I come at this whole journey on Guilty Greenie as Cait is the expert, and my carbon footprint, I wouldn't know it from my tennis elbow most of the time. Yeah. So it's literally, I am the listener trying to kind of get that information and find those little bite-sized chunks that I can put into my everyday life that seem achievable. But something you just said, I have to know the answer to before we go any further. What do you remember is the most sustainable diet? Because both Cait and I are different diets here, so...
It depends on what you're looking at, right? If you're looking at just from a climate change lens, which is kind of a silly thing to do, is to just look at climate change and not like the other impacts. But if you want to feed the most people with the lowest number of greenhouse gas emissions, corn and tofu, those are the two, corn and soy, those are the two crops. I think it was the smallest greenhouse gas emissions. They have the best bang for their buck, I guess. Shellfish, mollusks growing, like they can be grown in a way that can actually reduce carbon emissions. I think this is me remembering this story.
Yes, obviously the episode, we'll link it in the show notes. But I'm loving where this is going. 2 ticks for me, and I think 0 for you, Cait. But
tofu and tacos, I think, was how we landed on it. That's just from a climate change perspective. There's a whole lot of problems with, pesticide, everything else like that, runoff from how we grow industrial corn and soy, and not to mention lack of biodiversity. All that stuff. But if you're just looking at the narrow window of greenhouse gas emissions, I think our landing was tofu tacos.
We won't hold you to it.
Yeah. And also, obviously, the massive lack of flavor that you've got to inject into a tofu to make it edible.
Yeah.
And I say that as a vegetarian.
Absolutely.
Ugh.
I haven't listened to that episode in like a year.
Talking of WTF, like as in the mollusks is a bit of a WTF moment, can you give us any examples of other ones that since you've been on Outside In, you've gone like, oh, that's a WTF moment to me?
Let's see. Hunting deer is quite a sustainable way to feed yourself if you're following the rules and regulations of your state. And if you do it yourself, that's a very sustainable way to get meat in most places because our deer populations are really, really, really high, especially in the East. There are a ton of deer, in part because they don't have any predators really anymore. And the way that we've changed the ecosystem in the East Coast, that was the WTF for me. I'm just going through the Rolodex of episodes that we've done. We did a story that I thought was very interesting. And it's not necessarily about climate change or sustainability, but it is about wild horses and why we don't eat horse meat in this country.
Oh, I am in. I'm in. Tell me.
So just very briefly, wild horses are very controversial out west. There are arguments that they compete with cattle for forage. They can degrade the land in some areas, and their populations are very, very high right now. And so the Navajo Nation in 2018 proposed doing a horse harvest, so a horse hunt, and it was immediately shut down. Protests, people were very angry about it, but it got us thinking, why are we so against killing and eating horses in this country? Because when it comes to cattle, we do it all the time. Like beef, you can get a hamburger in every restaurant in this country, but you can't get a horse burger. And that's not the same in other places like Quebec, parts of Europe. And so we did this deep dive into like what happened with horse meat, because there were times in this country where we have eaten horse meat. After World War II, people were eating horse meat. In fact, President Harry Truman was known as Horse Meat Harry as kind of a disparaging nickname because we were eating horse and not beef. Because horse has always been seen as kind of the food of poverty, especially in Europe. We started eating it essentially, we'd eaten it for a long time. Then there was a papal decree that said we shouldn't eat it anymore. And then there was, I think it was a siege during the Napoleonic Wars that they couldn't get food, so they started eating their horses. And so then it just became known as when there's war, we eat horses. So there's just like a lot of really weird, fun facts in that episode about why we do or don't eat horse meat. That I expected us to get a lot of angry letters, and we didn't get any. And I was kind of bummed. I was like, this feels very controversial, talking about eating horses. But people said they liked the story, but we never got hate mail.
Yeah, I would have assumed you would have gotten some comments, especially because several years ago, the whole horse meat in IKEA meatballs. And
yes.
Outrage.
But then you go to France and you'll be sitting somewhere and somebody will rock up on the menu with a horse shank beside me at the restaurant, and I'll be like, wow, that's challenging me. It's really challenging me. So I get it. I'm surprised you didn't get some horse hate mail.
Yeah, I know, especially considering how controversial of a subject it is in the West. It's weird, the stories that you'll get hate mail for. You're just like, I didn't expect that in a million years, that people would be very angry at this story.
So talking then about feedback, denialism. I think that's a good segue into that, because we do hear from people who just want to flat out deny this is not man-made, although that is decreasing, going more into new skepticism, so attacking the solutions or the science itself. With any feedback on the show, has any of it been denial focused? And if it has been, have you seen a shift from old denialism to new denialism, or what are you seeing on that front?
I don't think people that are traditional climate denialists are listening to our show. That is the world of media today, right? Unfortunately, we're not on broadcast. And podcasts, you can pick and choose which ones you want to listen to. I think it's pretty evident we do a lot of climate change-centered stories, so that I don't get people that are listening from a space of like, I don't believe in climate change. I think that we do host like pretty robust debates on solutions, and we like to interrogate solutions. I think if you have a healthy skepticism of what have been proposed as solutions is an important thing, because that's the thing is we keep trying to essentially reinvent the same wheel. EVs, for instance, they are a pathway towards a net zero future. At the same time, so is increased public transit, and EV batteries are incredibly heavy. They're incredibly intensive to mine. Lithium, all these new critical mineral mining projects are popping up throughout the West. I think it's in Nevada. It is a very important spot for tribes in that region. I think that you should have some skepticism over the solutions, a healthy, intelligent conversation about it, because you're going to have to weigh the pros and cons. There's often not a perfect silver bullet for this stuff, and it's still going to hurt something. And I think that's important to understand what it's hurting. So I hope that we are able to foster that kind of conversation. That doesn't mean that you don't get an EV. It does mean that if you've got a 20-year-old Toyota Yaris that gets, 40 miles to the gallon, you just drive that and drive it less versus buying a brand new Tesla. I think it's good to interrogate that kind of stuff. Does that make sense?
Yes, especially around the EVs, the mining in Congo. I'm glad to see it hitting the public conscience right now. But to your point, there is no perfect solution. There never has been a perfect solution. And I do think we need to, as you mentioned, critically interrogate what's going on, all the different very complex steps that go into it and who and what it is affecting. That is slightly different, though. Having a healthy debate or discussion or interrogation of solutions is different than denying the solution in favor of continuing to rely on fossil fuels, for instance. Are you seeing that denialism narrative evolve?
I see it in the town and the state that I live in. I live in a small town in Montana, and towards, let's say, wind power projects, turbines, they kill birds of prey, thus we should not have them. There's a lot of things that are fed by fossil fuel companies that kind of doubt over certain projects, or like carbon sequestration. That's going to be the win-win. Exxon has a giant project in Wyoming that they say this allows us to then be able to continue pumping more oil because then we're sequestering the carbon. What they don't say is that something like 70% of that carbon is actually not getting sequestered. It's being sold back to other fossil fuel companies to essentially be used to get more oil. So I see that kind of conversation happening. Now, I think it's important to say, the media that I digest is going to be like the New York Times and the Atlantic and the New Yorker and NPR, that I think do a pretty good job of interrogating solutions without being like, this just doesn't work. But it's also really important to watch Fox News and to read the Wall Street Journal. There was a great story we did last year about wildfire smoke. And I think it's a really good example of how I've seen climate denialism or a skepticism come out in politics. Just to be really short, do you remember last year when all that smoke came into the East Coast from wildfires in Quebec?
Yes,
and there were politicians in the West that essentially were saying this is what the West has to deal with every summer because of poor forest management. The argument that essentially you need more logging in the woods, that will fix the wildfire problem. And so I ended up interviewing former Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke. He was the Interior Secretary under Trump. He's now a Montana congressman. And the conversation we had wasn't climate denialism. It's like, yes, I believe that climate change, in part at least, man has a role in it. But there was just a seeding of doubt every time about how much of this is actually causing wildfires. The argument being that our forests are so undermanaged that they've been allowed to grow wildly, and that's what's prompting these fires. That is one problem. The other problem is the fact that it's getting really, really hot in the summertime and dry, and that creates the tinder that allows the spark to fly, in part. And so that was a conversation that got really frustrating because it just went around in circles, and it was just seeding doubt at the very idea of the question that wildfires are not due to climate change, but instead poor forest management. And so I think I see it in interviews with more conservative-leaning folks. But in our listenership and in the media that I digest, I see a pretty healthy ecosystem of climate coverage.
Yeah, it's injecting that little bit of skepticism, so it's not that you have to disprove the science.
Yeah, exactly. Questions are good until they're not good. Questions are good when you still believe the foundation that the climate is warming and we need to find solutions to stop that. It's not good when you use the question to essentially say the climate is warming. There's nothing we can do about it, so drill, baby, drill.
Yes.
Drill, baby, drill.
Sarah, you had asked a question earlier about trusting information, especially with new solutions.
Oh, yeah. This is something that comes up quite a lot when we're talking generally, because for somebody who's not immersed in the environmental space all the time, you get a lot of stuff that pops up on social media. And I'm interested to know, we've kind of touched on it now, in terms of how do people just generally in the public know how to authenticate what they're seeing from products that are being created, that they're not being greenwashed, that kind of thing. It's really difficult as a consumer to know.
It's really difficult. There was an episode we did about essentially how do you make your 401k more sustainable. We're really looking at like green investments, and it's very hard to sometimes just do that on your own and to pick and choose, okay, this investment portfolio says that it's really, really green. But once you look inside, you're like, there's ExxonMobil and there's Chevron in here, and we don't have a good regulation for ESG for our climate investments. And so I totally get it. It's really hard to decide like what's being greenwashed and what's not. But I think sometimes when it comes to investments, for instance, there are entire portfolio managers, people who will help you manage your retirement in a way that they are the ones actually opening the hood of the car and looking in and figuring out, okay, this is actually a pretty good portfolio that you should invest your retirement into. But yeah, it's incredibly hard with the amount of misinformation and disinformation and greenwashing that happens in this country. And like, what should I be focusing on and what should I not be focusing on? That I think is really challenging for people. Focus on encouraging your lawmaker to pass legislation that creates more robust regulations for ESG, for instance, so that we can actually parse through which companies are working towards a net zero future and which ones are not. There's big stuff that you can do, writing letters, that kind of thing. And then there's other stuff like focusing on your diet, I think is really important, and trying to do a little bit of your own research. But like listening to shows like us and Guilty Greenie, I think that really helps being able to parse through all the BS because there's a lot of it out there.
Yeah.
One of the things we do is at the end of each episode, I give Sarah a challenge, and you brought up banking. And that was one of the challenges I gave her, was to go to her bank and see where the money was being invested. And part of these challenges is it's not a pass or fail. It's not a succeed or not. It's to understand the complexities and the fact that you do sometimes need to bring someone in to help you parse through all the information. It's a lot. Yeah,
absolutely. It's a ton. And having those people that are a little bit more knowledgeable than you in one place like investment banking is very helpful.
Yeah. Because you don't know what you don't know.
Exactly. And it's okay to not know that stuff and to find help.
I hold my hands up to all the stuff I don't know. It's quite the list. The list.
Yep.
Nate, is there things you've listened to on the outside in from the experts that you've had on, because you do have some incredible experts on the show as well, that you've then taken into your life and changed your daily practices because of?
I think the sustainable eating one was very helpful. I am an adult onset hunter, so I started hunting a few years ago. And
is that an actual term?
It's a term within
I love that.
Within the hunting world, like people who didn't learn as kids. My dad didn't hunt, and so I found some good mentors to help me with hunting. And I think it's made that a more important part of my life now, because I do like eating a burger and I want to be able to do that. And I live in a place where there are a lot of deer. And so I can go and I can hunt a deer. I got 2 deer last fall and I still have meat left from that. That's less trips to the grocery store. I live an hour away from a grocery store in the town that I'm in. So that's less driving to the grocery store. That's food that I literally got out my back door. And so that's been one that after that episode, talking to the folks that we did, I felt much better, and that became a much more important part of my life. The other one, I think we did our EV episode, and one of the takeaways was the amount of energy it costs to create a vehicle is tremendous, whether it's an EV or a gasoline-powered vehicle. And so not getting caught up in this idea of selling our vehicles every few years to get like a new one because it's got slightly better gas mileage. It's just, drive less, bike when you can, and when you do have to drive, try to keep your car for as long as you can is something that I've thought more about. Valuing the things I have, not trying to throw away as much, whether that's a car, whether that's clothing, trying to just wear and fix clothing for longer, and just trying to keep your stuff longer and not toss as much away has been one of the big lessons I've learned over this job, talking to a lot of people over the past few years. Yeah, some of the best things you can do is keep the things you have, take care of them, drive less, fix your clothes, and try to eat tofu tacos.
And get some flavor in the tofu.
Yeah, exactly.
That is just a lovely kind of takeaway list of things that we can all kind of put into practice. So I think it's a good time to maybe segue into our highs and lows of the week.
I think Nate gets to choose if he wants to start with highs or lows first.
Let's see. Well, I just flew back from Washington, D.C. for a conference, which was a lot of jet setting. So I kind of feel a little low about that. But high note, it was a conference with a bunch of public media journalists learning how to better tell these kinds of stories, which I think is important to kind of weed through the disinformation. So I just told my highs and lows. I'm sorry. I just went right into my lows and highs.
That's
perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So that was a high for me, was learning how to better tell environmental stories.
What was your one key takeaway, if you had one, from that conference?
One that was really nice was when we tell stories, they can be so big and you really have to have focus. And so one person said, take your big story that you're doing and break it all the way down until it's just a haiku. 5, 7, 5. That sums up your story. That creates what we call a nut graph, which is kind of like your summary of the story. And from there you can build out, but it gives you hyper focus, is to take this big, big thing and create a haiku out of it and then build from there, which I thought was a really, really great way to maintain focus in storytelling, because it's very easy to just branch out and get yourself lost in the weeds. So that was my big takeaway, I think.
Yeah, that's
stealing that.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a really good one. When you're feeling overwhelmed, break something down into a haiku. It's very helpful.
I'm going to go a limerick instead. I feel like I'm more of a limerick person than a haiku. Give myself a few more rhyming couplets.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, so then Sarah, what was your, I guess we're doing highs first then. We'll come back to your low.
My high and low are linked to my husband.
Oh.
We have been, so we've been on this kind of journey of putting in eco swaps over the last, year or two. And he's been like a real slow learner, literally Neanderthal knuckles on the ground, doesn't seem to get it. And so the other day he'd gone and he'd purchased 2 items, and the first one came out of the bag and I was like, oh my God, cracked it. He's finally got it. And it was, and this is really sad, but we love a eco tablet for the dishwasher. So I was like, yay, great, sustainable packaging. Well done, well done. And then he proceeds to pull out a large container of weed killer that is literally as poisonous as freaking, I don't know. But I was like, I don't know if you've really got the message there, dude. But so, yeah, that's my highs and lows together. Yeah. Also, my low is I've just got back from Nashville and I live in London. So another terrible, terrible carbon footprint there. But so I'm with you, Nate, on the flying one.
Yeah.
Both of you, it's for work. You're not using your private jet to go shopping.
Exactly.
30 minutes away.
No, I only use my private jet to go to Nashville. Cait, what's yours? Highs and lows. You're going to just have to combine them now.
Mine is combined as well. Nate, you've started a trend, and this is not how this usually goes. They tend to be very separate. So,
all right.
My low is the amount of plastic. And when I say amount of plastic, I mean thousands and thousands of plant pots for all the seedlings. I mean, I'm not giving myself an out, but I will say I did invest in a higher quality plastic so I can reuse them over the years. It's not the single, flimsy little pots. The high of that, I guess, is the farm is back up and running and we are producing 50-cent tomatoes that took a couple hundred to create.
Nice.
I love that. I mean, that's good. Is there pots that you can get? There must be pots that you can get that aren't obviously plastic though, right?
Yes, there is quite a few different methods. So some people use like the cocoa I can never say that word, pots that will break down. I personally have tried those in years past. They haven't broken down for me. And so it's stunted specifically like with my peppers, which isn't great. You can use something called seed blocks where you make your own mixture. You can buy pre-made mixture, moisten the soil, and then it's almost like a stamp. And it'll put little hole in it, and then the next size up you'd plug that one into that one and that one, and so people will use wooden boxes or just trays, and something we might look into if we continue to scale up, because I will say repotting thousands and thousands of little seedlings into bigger pots is quite time intensive. So
I bet.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to take any notes on that because I've been banned from any kind of horticulture after my COVID greenhouse experience, which produced $100 cucumber. That's
Oh,
pretty
wow.
much the investment per cucumber that I got out of that.
I've had a similar thing with strawberries. I've spent a lot of time and water trying to grow a strawberry plant, and then I got like 3 little strawberries. They were delicious, but I was like, well, this is a lot of work.
3 little strawberries.
Second year for strawberries.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great. Thank you. Thanks for having me. This was a fun conversation.
Absolutely. And I know our audience is going to appreciate the takeaways, things to look out for. And also, the one thing we like to leave with is it's okay not to be sure, and it's okay not to be okay. And it's okay to continue to ask questions because we're still doing it. We have to.
Yeah.
And that's how we get better.
Yeah, exactly. It's a process of figuring it all out, and a complicated one.
Thank you so much for joining us, Nate. Can you remind everybody where they can find your fabulous podcast?
Yes, you can go anywhere you get podcasts. It's called Outside In. That's outside/in. There's another one that's a business podcast that went defunct a couple of years ago. We're not that one. We're the environmental one. So outside/in.
Love it. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Del.
If you've enjoyed this show, please make sure to share, rate, and or leave a 5-star review on any podcast platform. It helps others find the podcast and get that climate conversation flowing.
Guilty Greenie is an independently made podcast. So if you would like to support this podcast and our work, please go to buymeacoffee.com/Guilty Greenie.
Until next time, stay curiously green.